Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Good to have you all with us. I'm Marc Steiner. And, the question of the future of Palestine and Israel, of the Israeli occupation, of this nation's commitment to Israel, our seeming disdain for the future of the Palestinian people, always seem to be at the forefront of issues we have to confront. It affects not only our domestic politics, forces us to address the thorn that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, it also affects the entire Mideast policy from North Africa to Turkey, the Arabian Peninsula to Iran. Now, add to that, during this worldwide COVID pandemic, Israel's horrendous policy of vaccinating settlers but not vaccinating Palestinians in the occupied territories, despite the Herculean effort the Palestinian authorities have made to control the pandemic with few resources. Today, we're joined once again by Phyllis Bennis, director of the new Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies that focuses on the Middle East, U.S. wars, and issues relating to the UN. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and she now serves on the National Board of the Jewish Voices for Peace, author of 11 books, and the latest being the reissue of her book, Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. And we're also joined by James Zogby, who is founder and president of the Arab American Institute. He's also the managing director of Zogby Research Services, former member of the DNC, advisor to Bernie Sanders before, and author of Arab Voices, What They Are Saying to Us and Why It Matters. And Phyllis and Jim, welcome. Good to have you all with us. Let's just start with this kind of what I said earlier, the horrendous story coming out of the occupied territories where Israel has refused COVID vaccinations to Palestinians, but took care of settlers. I was just finishing the report by Joseph Gideon in The Nation and understanding what is actually going on in terms of what the PA tried to do. So Phyllis, let me start with you. I think this has not gotten the play it deserves or the conversation it deserves. Despite having been involved in issues around this since 1968, this just one blew my mind. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, this is really one of the clearest examples around. This is vaccine apartheid that we're seeing in very direct action. I've actually been surprised that there's been as much coverage as there has been. There's been quite a bit of it, particularly in the international press, but even in the mainstream US press, there's been some discussion, some referencing of it. And this is, it's always this false equivalency that, well, the Israelis say and the Palestinians say, and many nations believe without any reality. It's like we're giving up on the notion that international law does exist. It's not that nations believe that Israel as the occupying power has an obligation under international law. It's that that's the language of international law. That's the language of the Geneva Conventions that says the occupying power has the obligation to provide exactly this, prophylactic healthcare to prevent pandemics. It's written in stone. This is not, some nations believe and the Israelis disagree. This isn't about that. This is about reality. And the reality is that people are dying because they're not getting vaccines and because of the years of occupation of the West Bank, and especially the besieged territory of the Gaza Strip, which has been facing this all-sided Israeli blockade and siege since 2006 now. There is no sufficient healthcare system. The notion that, well, the Palestinians are responsible for their own healthcare. Well, they would be if they were allowed to have an economy that allowed them to control their own borders, control their own water, control who goes in and who goes out. None of that is accessible to Palestinians. The Israelis control it all. That's why the term apartheid has become so important, because of the precision of it. It implies that, according to, again, international law, the International Covenant Against the Crime of Apartheid, says very clearly that when you have one landmass, one big territory, controlled by one government, in this case, the government of Israel, despite the sort of municipal authority of the Palestinians in various components of it, that the Israelis control it all, and there are two or more separate legal systems that people are held accountable to, depending on whether they're Jewish or Palestinian. That's the definition of apartheid. And in this case, where that distinction determines whether or not you get a life-saving vaccine, or if you get the virus, whether you will have access to life-saving treatment, this is a deadly, deadly kind of apartheid.
Jim, what would you like to add to that? I mean, we'll get to the B'Tselem report on apartheid in a minute as well, but please go ahead.
Well, I think Phyllis said it all. It's racism at its core, and it is apartheid. And I think I agree with her that I've been surprised at how much coverage it has received in the U.S. press in particular, and the fact that we have very early in the new session members of Congress who've been writing some surprises. Tim Kaine, for example, in the U.S. Senate. I mean, it's not surprising the members of Congress who've signed on, but I think this is presenting a challenge to the Israeli Hezbollah, uh, the machinery of Hezbollah, which from the beginning of the pandemic, I found it initially quite humorous that they sent out two stories that an Israeli vaccine was imminent. That scientists in Israel, given the genius of Israeli medicine, they were on the verge of a discovery. It was back in early April. Nothing happened. A couple of months later, another story without even mentioning the fact that the first one never happened. And then they were again in April. They were the number one. They were touting themselves as the number one country in controlling the pandemic, and they were obviously it looked like they were doing it to promote tourism, right? That they were suffering from it, and they were advertising that we had brought it under control, no one else had done it, etc. And then the spikes began to hit, and they blamed the spikes on the ultra-Orthodox and Arabs, as if they were not really citizens of Israel that one ought to be concerned about. And then now this, we're the number one provider of vaccines. And despite the fact they paid 3 times the market price to get the vaccine, and that Netanyahu is using it as an election tool, not so much to care for lives as it is to secure the election as the guy who gets the job done. And so now the Hezbollists are being challenged with this story that, yeah, you're doing a great job, but you got 5 million people. I did an MSNBC show making the point, and they went berserk, writing to MSNBC, not only challenging me, but the host for even having raised the question and not challenged me, because I was using falsehoods. The falsehoods, what they called falsehoods, were the very things that Phyllis talked about, that I mentioned international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which they said didn't apply because Oslo. And I find it interesting that they use Oslo to justify them not doing it when they have not honored any provision of Oslo. They predetermined the borders of Jerusalem. They have unilaterally annexed. They have expanded settlements throughout the territories. They've taken resources, water resources, etc. They've done all the things to violate Oslo. But on this one, now, all of a sudden, it's the Palestinian responsibility. But they're getting caught on it. I think that's a good thing.
So well, let's talk about what that might mean, what it could portend about what's to come. I mean, as you talked about, it's been raised in the House floor. People are talking about it in the press. But then on the other side, you have people like Anthony Blinken, who will be the new Secretary of State, responding to Ted Cruz when Cruz asked him, "Do you agree that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and do you commit that the United States will keep our embassy there?" And of course, Blinken's response was yes and yes. So when you see that juxtaposed with this scathing critique of what Israel's doing in terms of vaccinations and the occupied territories, and you don't hear a word, at least maybe I missed it, and you'll correct me, from the new Biden-Harris administration about the vaccination crisis in the occupied territories. What do you think this portends for where policy is going to go with the United States vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel? Phyllis, you can start, and then Jim, just jump right in, please.
Sure. I think that we have to look more broadly at the political moment in which the Biden-Harris administration is coming in. What we've seen in their first few days has been evidence of what we were already seeing, hoping that we were right, that there has been real impact on this administration from the rise of a progressive left wing of the Democratic Party. For the first time, really since the 30s, a progressive wing that has some real power, some real clout within the party. And externally, both the summer's Black Lives Matter protests, the extraordinary movement around climate, the movements around immigrant rights, all have had a real impact. And we've seen a shift in the policies of this administration on climate most overtly, but also on immigrant rights, somewhat on labor and the economy, and certainly on healthcare. Where we have not seen a shift in this big gap between the centrist or the right wing of the party, the Biden wing, and the progressive wing is on foreign policy. And that's a bigger struggle. So what we're seeing right now is the scenario playing out that we were all sort of afraid of. Middle East policy right now is going to be focused, I'm afraid, very much on maintaining the very hostile relationship with Iran. So the relationship between the US and Israel, which has its own dynamics, both as a domestic issue, domestic political issue, and as a long-term economic and strategic/military connection, is shaped and reshaped in the context of the US maintaining a very hostile relationship to Iran. I have no doubt that Biden wants to go back to the Iran deal. That was Obama's singular, most important diplomatic accomplishment, and he's going to want to hold on to that legacy. But what we are not yet seeing evidence of, although the appointment of Wendy Sherman as the number 2 at the State Department and the potential possibility of the appointment of Rob Malley as the main interlocutor with Iran would bode well for serious negotiations. But that we don't know yet. What we heard, as you referenced in the confirmation hearings, was the view that yes, we want to go back to the Iran nuclear deal, but only when Iran has come back into compliance, as if Iran has been the main problem in undermining the deal, when the undermining of the deal was all the responsibility of the United States. And this notion that, well, that was then, that was the Trump administration, we're different. That doesn't work in foreign policy. The sanctions that were imposed that ended up with children dying of malnutrition, something unprecedented in modern Iranian history, those were not Trump sanctions, those were American sanctions. And that's the context in which it has to be seen. So the question about Israel's role, the moving of Israel into the jurisdiction of Central Command, along with the Arab countries, rather than being part of the European Command, as it used to be, that's an indication of this. The normalization between Israel and the Gulf monarchies that's underway is very much in the context of building up this mobilization against Iran. The question of Palestine and the rights of Palestinians are simply not in the equation. So I think it's very definitely likely and certainly true that Biden and Blinken, although they are longstanding supporters of Israel, I doubt that either of them were happy about Trump's moves to transfer the embassy to Jerusalem, to acknowledge the illegal occupation of the Golan Heights as legitimate, to the efforts to legitimize Israeli settlements and the nation-state law that legalizes apartheid within Israel. But they're not prepared to change any of those. So it all comes back to what are our movements able to mobilize to force them to make those changes? How do we use this political moment when there is this new openness in the country at large, in the United States, in the media, in every arena, to hear about Palestinian rights, to think through the question of what this U.S. military aid to Israel has led to, and to think about it differently, to think about challenging it. Even now, members of Congress are taking this up. So it's an incredible moment. It's an incredible optimistic moment, but it's only going to mean something if our movements can come together to use this political moment to make those changes necessary and to convince people in Washington that not only is it no longer political suicide to criticize Israel, that hasn't been true for a long time, but that it's soon going to be political suicide not to criticize Israel. And that's the movement that we need to move towards this new reality.
As someone who's been in the DNC, as someone who's been dealing with this issue, where do you think this takes us?
Well, look, we're not going to measure progress here in huge leaps forward, but we are going to see change, and we're already seeing change. The platform, for all of its weakness on Israel-Palestine, did change language in areas that we had not seen before. And I've been waging the platform fight since the 80s. And there was
Yes, you have.
there was give on issues that we had not seen before. I don't hold the platform up as policy. It never is. What the platform is the beginning of a measure of where the balance of forces are in the party and in the country. And I think that we saw evidence in the platform of the fact that there was a recognition that progressive voices needed to be heard. And I think that's going to be the case as we move forward. I mean, we're seeing, like I said, Tim Kaine, no small figure, challenging the issue of what is being called correctly apartheid and vaccine apartheid in the territories. We're also seeing members of Congress in larger numbers than ever challenging on this issue. And I think that that's going to have an impact on how the policy moves forward. There are some constraints. Number one, we have a hyper-partisan environment and Republicans who are crazed on this issue, Democrats who are fearful and holding their private parts as they do or say anything on the issue. You also have a strong progressive current in the country, which I think these things have to be factored together. In Israel, you have a situation where no matter who wins this next election, it's going to be either far right or far right. Netanyahu is the least of the far right. I mean, the people running against him, that people are saying, "Oh boy, I hope these guys win." They're horrible. They're worse than he is. The one thing they aren't is as dishonest as he is, as manipulative, as maneuvering as he is. They're just honest, straightforward, bigot annexationists, right? And then you have a Palestinian political system that is completely collapsed. Given that, I mean, I think you give, you figure that this is going to take some time to sort itself out. So when Tony Blinken is asked the question by Ted Cruz, and you want to get yourself confirmed, I'd say you probably don't want to say Israel's a racist state. I think you probably don't want to say you're going to move the embassy back. Number one, I don't think anybody thinks the embassy is going to get moved back anyway, even on the Palestinian side. What they want the consulate opened. They want unimpeded access to the consulate, and they want the consulate to be a future Palestinian capital. Those are
and when you
things
say
they
consulate,
want.
just to interrupt for a moment, when you say
The U.S.
consulate, for our viewers, you're talking in the Palestinian side of Jerusalem.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
correct. Just make sure.
That is the
Right.
Palestinian side of Jerusalem that we can't forget. And that's what they want the Biden administration to do. Will that happen? I think that they've committed to some of it in the platform. I think we have a grounds to continue to press harder on these issues. And I think we'll see some movement. I do think we'll see movement.
I mean, one of the things that you wrote about in one of your recent Nation articles was the Great Unraveling, even as bad as it was, of policies towards Israel and Palestine under Trump, and how difficult it's going to be to pedal back from all of that. Whether it's in terms of acknowledging the settlements, to making made in Israel from the settlements as well, to much larger issues that we're facing, that this is not going to be easy to unravel. The question is, how does that happen?
It's
And
not.
where do you think the debates will take place?
I think that what we are is clearly in a one-state reality, and that a lot of what passes as we want movement toward an unrealistic negotiation to achieve an unrealistic goal, the two-state solution, none of which is ever going to happen. And so what we want is our policies that advocate and support human rights, equality, justice for Palestinians as citizens of a single state of Israel, Palestine. That's where we are, and that's what we've got. And I think we've got to deal with that. I don't think that, seeing progress toward negotiations means anything. It's negotiations toward what? Um, and so, to me, the measure of success in policy is going to be, are Palestinian human rights, is Palestinian equality, and is justice for Palestinians being pursued and furthered by these policies. And that's, I think, what we want to focus on right now.
It seems as if in some ways we are reaching a different point around Israel and Palestine in U.S. politics, despite what happened with Blinken. But with the rise of the progressive and left inside the Democratic Party, the issues are being raised there. The whole issues you see in this country around the battles on campuses and what Zoom has done, that we're reaching a different point here, and that there seems to be a movement growing, even inside, in larger and larger numbers inside the Jewish community as well, around Israel, and trying to find a different way to address this. So I'm curious, with this new administration, Phyllis, where you see this going.
Well, I think the key thing is, as you say, this political moment that we're in. We have been seeing for the last decade or more an extraordinary shift in public discourse on this issue. The question of support for Israel has become a profoundly partisan question. It's no longer this bipartisan consensus that it once was. Republicans now say at about 61, 62% that they hold the Israeli government in high esteem. Only 26% of Democrats say that. If you ask young Democrats, it's even lower. If you ask Democrats of color, it's lowest of all. And there's an enormous shift underway in the Jewish community, away from this instinctive support for Israel that many of us, like me, grew up with. I think that the question of this discourse shift, along with the broader rise of a progressive wing of the Democratic Party, stronger than we've seen since the 1930s, we're seeing a scenario in which the understanding of U.S. support for Israel is dramatically changing. The $3.8 billion a year that the U.S. gives of our tax money directly to the Israeli military is no longer taken as a matter of course. It's now being discussed. Should it be contingent in the Congress? Should there be human rights qualifications put on it that it cannot be used if there are human rights violations underway? These kinds of discussions at elite levels, including within Congress, has never been the case until now, until this last couple of years. The B'Tselem report from inside Israel, talking about Israeli apartheid, reflects that. And the attacks that are underway across the United States, the attacks on student groups that are bringing Palestinian speakers, that are calling for support for the boycott movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. A lot of those attacks are emerging precisely because the supporters of Israel in the United States are very much aware that they are losing their influence. They're losing their youth. They're losing young Jews. Young Jews growing up now have all kinds of options, organizations to join, different approaches. Should you define your Judaism in a religious sense? Should it be in a social justice arena? And if it's in social justice, is it social justice except for Palestine, or do you include Palestine within that? More and more young Jews are picking the latter, and they're joining organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, like If Not Now. Even an organization like J Street, which is very limited in its critique of Israel, still plays a huge role in providing a kind of political cover for members of Congress who want to do the right thing for the first time and are looking for a way to not face a fear that it will be political suicide. It isn't any longer political suicide. Soon we're going to be at a moment when it's going to be political suicide not to take a strong critical view of Israel. And that's the moment that we're in right now. So I think we see a number of challenges ahead, and these attacks are nothing to take lightly. They are having a huge impact on the rights of free speech of Palestinian students, of Jewish students, and others who want to debate these issues freely on college campuses and elsewhere. But it's also a moment when the long-standing elite consensus around support for Israel as an unchangeable, unchanging given is simply not the case anymore. And the question is going to be, what's it going to take for us to show? We can't just tell. We have to show, our movements have to show the Biden and Harris administration and all the rest of Congress what this shift means, that their constituents are urging them to change their policy, that this isn't some fringe movement any longer, if it ever was. This is now as mainstream
So
as they
let me
come.
just conclude with this, and I think it's an important question to conclude on here in the few minutes we have left, that while all the things you both just said are absolutely true, and I think that the issues and the struggle around Israel and Palestine have heightened, given the nature of what Joe Biden has done before, given the things we've heard so far from both the new president and vice president, and the power of the establishment in terms of their viewpoint of what goes on in the Middle East, and all the other things taking place in the Middle East, from the battle over the Eastern Mediterranean to what's happening in all the conflicts from Syria to Somalia and the rest, and things that are happening, do you see the possibility of major fundamental change in policy towards Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East as a whole in this new administration? Jim,
Look,
you wrote about this just recently. You jump in and please, and then Phyllis jump right in, and we'll conclude.
Let me put it this way: the U.S. is not going to be the driver of change in this conflict. It's not going to be the driver of a resolution to this conflict. What it is going to be is it can either get out of the way and stop making it more difficult to deal with, but it can't do much more than that. I mean, I started with either or. It can't. I mean, what successive administrations have done is embolden Israel, make it, give it a sense of impunity, and provide all of the backup and assistance that Israel needs to continue doing this. Which is why Israeli politics have moved so far to the right, because people say, well, what does it matter? I mean, we can build. They say don't build settlements. We build them. They don't do anything. They say don't do this to Palestinians. We do it. They don't do anything. So why not do it? I mean, bad behavior unpunished or unsanctioned gets worse. That's what we learn with spoiled children. Therefore, what I'm looking to the Biden administration to do is simply not be as enabling, not much more than that. And the slightest peep from the U.S. of displeasure causes shockwaves in Israel, helps create a debate that hasn't existed in years now between the right and the dying left or the dead left in Israel. It could resuscitate a liberal movement in Israel. What is now called the center left in Israel is unrecognizable from anything that would pass as center left in any other country in the world. I mean, an outright annexationist bigot is considered the leading candidate in the center left. What's that all about? So what I want the U.S. to do is just stop making it worse. That's all. And then in the end of the day, the ultimate concern we have is that Israel has to have is that between the river and the sea, the majority of people are Arab. This is an unsustainable situation. They can have peace with every Arab country in the region. They can't have peace in themselves until they provide justice for Palestinians. And the Palestinians need to clean up their act and become a more viable political opposition force. You've got the joint list, which is fracturing. They need to heal that divide. You have the Fatah and Hamas, which are just terrible, both of them. You need a popular resistance movement in the territories that actually makes a difference. The U.S. can't do anything about that. The U.S. can do is stop making Israel worse, but the Palestinians got to fix their situation up. And when they do, I think you'll see a resistance movement that's going to be difficult to hold back.
Maybe that'll bring the tens of thousands of Israeli leftists in exile back to Israel, but we'll find out. Phyllis?
You know, I think I agree with everything that Jim said. I think that this is a very, very challenging moment. We know that foreign policy overall is not going to be the first priority of the new administration. They are dealing with an extraordinarily high level of crisis at home in terms of the COVID pandemic and its resulting economic crisis. The level of consciousness about the rise of white supremacy in this country and the issue of inequality is massive. And those are going to be, along with climate, the fundamental first priorities. Foreign policy, as long as they can, they will push back. They will kick the can down the road. The problem is that that process normalizes these horrific things that the Trump administration has done. The symbolism of allowing to stand the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, the recognition of the Golan Heights as somehow legitimate, the acceptance of a possible annexation process and a consolidation of legal apartheid inside Israel. All of these things, to the degree that they continue under the Biden administration and become normalized, that's very dangerous because it makes it much harder to reverse them later. So it's inevitable that it's going to be this way, I think, but it's going to make things harder. What we have to be looking for in the future is this understanding that it does not belong to the United States, as Jim said, to determine the outcome in Palestine, just as in the Palestinian rights movement around the world. What has been a very important shift is away from the debate over one state or two states, red state, blue state. It's now about Palestinian rights. It's up to Palestinians and Israelis how many states they want to have on that little piece of land. It's not up to me. I'm a Jewish girl from California. Why do I get to have a say in the matter? It doesn't make any sense. What does make sense is to get out of the way, to allow Palestinians to build a movement for their rights, to claim their rights that have been denied for so long. That's what we're looking at. And there are movements underway that are looking to help Palestinians, provide support for Palestinians to do that. The US government, as Martin Luther King said when he identified it as the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, is still that. And it's the biggest preventer of a solution to this long-running occupation and apartheid system of any in the world. So it's our job here in the United States. It's not going to be up to us to liberate Palestine. What's up to us is to stop our government from doing everything it can to prevent the Palestinians from winning their own freedom.
It's always a pleasure to talk with the two of you, and I really appreciate you taking your time and your busy schedules to do this. Phyllis Bennis and Jim Zogby, thanks so much for joining us here. And we'll continue our coverage of the Middle East and Palestine and Israel, of course. Thank you both so much. It's always a pleasure to have the two of them on joining us. And thank you all for joining us here. And please, you see that scrolling across the bottom, mss@therealnews.com. Let us know what you think about this episode and other things here on the Marc Steiner Show. Thanks for joining us.